Hello and welcome to the Cube Talk Show, and my name is Joe Barbieri. I'm your host, and today we have one guest in our studio, Shawn Dalton, and he's done a range of things, but we'll be talking about personal credit, pensions, a variety of personal topics. Shawn's here with us. Shawn, how are you?
Hey Joe, I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Do you want to just give us some background about what you've studied and what you do?
Back in around 2002, 2003, I was doing security work in a grocery store in the night. And the shifts are long, they're boring. They start at 9:30 and end at 8 in the morning. I have to sleep all day to recover from them. So in order to stay awake and stay sane, I would read books. And the books I read were about the history of the banks, the credit cards, the pensions, the mutual fund industry. I ended up building my own private library in under 2 years. So it was about 25,000 pages of research. And now I am working on a book, which you are helping me with. Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah. So that's a lot of research. And, well, I can start with personal credit or personal debt. It's kind of the same idea. What, just in general, any general thoughts on that, that topic?
Yeah, actually, I think people live on a borrowed future. I think the last article I saw, the debt-to-equity ratio in Canada was 147%, or for every $100 of equity that people had, they owed $147. And that transcends across all lines of middle class, lower class, or even upper class, because you have the university and college students with student loans, with credit card debt. You have middle-aged workers, blue-collar workers, even senior management with car loans, condo loans. Everyone's in debt to the banks, basically. You know, and debt finances this whole consumeristic society that we live in. You know, so they literally control everything.
Yeah, so from what I understand, that's been going on for a little while. Well, there was actually a time when people didn't have much debt.
Yeah, actually, sorry.
I think of, well, my parents used to have an expression, and it translated into English meant uglier than debt. And what that means is if you had debt, you were strange, you were an outcast of society, you generally didn't fit in. And that was maybe 60 years ago. And today, what you just said is what's going on. So there's been a huge change, an opposite change over that amount of time.
When I was growing up, my parents didn't give me anything. Like, I remember when I bought my first bicycle, I bought it with beer can money. I would go along the highways with my brother, or in the dumpsters, or behind the baseball fields, and we would collect beer cans, bottles, and pop bottles. And the beer cans were worth 5 cents. They eventually went up to 10 cents, but that's not much of an increase. The beer bottles were worth 10 cents, and the milk jugs were worth a quarter, and the bottles were worth, I think, 15 or 20 cents. You know, like the Coke bottles. Remember, these were made of glass? Well,
That's right.
Yeah, you used to be able to return them for money, right? So my brother and I, we would do this for a couple months, and we eventually had enough money to buy our first bicycles. And I think we value money more than most people because it wasn't given to us. We had to actually hustle for it, whereas other kids would get $20 or $30 a week allowance for nothing or for doing minimal work. You know, we were forced to, you know, scrimp, and that's just the way it is, you know, the way it was. So you learn to appreciate something when you have to work for it. If you're given it for free, usually you don't appreciate it, you know. So I was never given anything for free. I had to work really hard for anything I got. You know, and that's a 1950s value. That's the style of the Puritan work ethic, whereas save for something and then get it instead of, you know, borrow and get it. You know, that's still my mentality. And same with my brother, same with my mom, and same with my dad. Even my grandparents are like that. They're very, you know, they're always looking for deals at the grocery store. You know, my grandma always collects coupons. So they're not alive anymore. They passed away last year and the year before, but they were always like that. And me and my brother have the same mentality. You know, where's the deal? You know, when is it on sale? You know.
What's the deal? Yeah.
Yeah, where's the deal?
So it's an interesting point you bring up, save and buy it, and now it's borrow and pay for it later. So what do you think, I guess, what do you think caused that, or when did you think that started happening?
With the rise of television. Television basically sells you realities that are impossible to achieve, that make you want things you don't really need. And you know what? They've gone so far, they've even put it in TV programs. You get reality TV shows with people wearing expensive things, driving expensive cars. People get excited when they see it. They think, oh, I want that. But, how, you know, this is very expensive to buy these things, these Corvettes or these, designer jackets or shirts. But the only way to get it if you don't have the money is to borrow it, to go on to credit, to use a credit card to buy it. And the reason credit card companies give college, university students 2 or 3 cards, even though they don't have a job yet, they know that their parents will bail them out, and that's the reason they do it. And they give you gag prizes on campus. They'll give you a little keychain or a free pizza. And for a free pizza, you'll be $30,000-$40,000 in debt. Maybe not you, but someone will be. And it really hurts. It really causes a lot of anxiety in young people's lives. They don't need that kind of pressure and stress when they have to study for exams and midterms. It just compounds the problem.
Yeah, that was, when I went to university, which was in the 90s, nobody was on campus, and I'm smiling because it's so different. When I was in college, I couldn't get a credit card, and I was the opposite. I had money in the bank. I mean, I didn't have a full-time job then, but I had money in the bank, and I tried to get a credit card, and they said, nope, not qualified. I had to wait till I was working 3 years to get a credit card.
Yeah, you actually had to be able to pay the money back. Like, it was more of a responsible
it's
proposition. It's changed quite a bit, actually.
So, and I've heard what you're saying, especially in the States. I've seen it on television, and so I guess that's part of it. They start you young when you're in school, before you work.
They call it cradle to grave. They want to get you when you're young, and they want to get you when you're older. They want you maxed out from the credit card when you're in school. They want your mortgage when you're middle age, and then they want your pension before you've retired. Right? It's actually a strategy developed by the big 6 banks in the country. I think Les Worthington wrote a book called The Banks, and he talked about this cradle to grave strategy. It was very specific. It exists. They actually think like that. Most people don't realize it, though. Most people think the bank is just a place where you get free money from. It's not. It's a private business run for maximum profits every 3 months. And there's a lot of pressure on these managers to do that. And they're very successful at it, and it's easy for them to do it because people borrow like crazy, So that's why the banks have record profits year after year, for the most part anyway. They make billions.
For the most part, yeah.
That's where they get it from you and I, doing these things,
So now, I'm hearing now the last few years, people are coming out and saying, pay your debt. Actually, the government came out recently and said, Canadians have too much debt. We're going to tighten up our mortgage rules. And I find that kind of ironic. But but that was, I think, just last week they did that. Instead of raising interest rates, that's what they were doing as a way of encouraging people to save. So do you think the saving mentality will come back?
I think it has to come back. People have no choice. They're pushed to the wall. Have you ever seen the cash and money stores or money marts on the Danforth?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Well, 30 years ago, there wasn't even one. Now there's 200 of them. Sometimes there's 2 on one block, and there's enough business for 2. So people are going in with their gold, their necklaces, the stuff their grandparents or parents gave them. They're like, how much can I get for this? Or how much can I get for that? And they'll have to sell it for less than they expect because they're full of anxiety and emotion, and they need to pay the debt off. They're getting credit collectors calling them at their house. They're getting letters in the mail. You have to pay your debt. You have to pay your credit card bill. And this is the thing, like, they don't actually want to collect your debt. They only want to collect the minimum payments. So the image of the reality that I get in my mind is, have you ever gone swimming?
Uh-huh.
You ever gone swimming in the lake when it was windy and it was kind of cold?
I haven't, but yeah.
I look at it as, if you're in a pool and it's cold, you obviously want to get out. You want to get warm. You want to get a towel. That's the image I get in my mind. You're in the pool and you're trying to get out of the pool, but someone's got their foot on your head. They're not drowning you, but they're not letting you out of the pool either. So you're always going to be cold. So you're always going to be in debt, owing these people money. And that's why when you get your credit card bill, or you phone or pay it, or even you go on the ATM machine, it goes, do you want to make the minimum payment of for $10? Like, say your bill's $200. They'll we want to make a $20 payment. It's only 10%, right? And I remember when I was in the bank, it was strange. Like, I went to the teller, because I'm not like most people. Like, I get a debt, I pay it off as fast as possible. I don't want to give these people free money. They're already making billions of dollars, so I don't need to add to the stockpile that they're making. I got to the front of the bank. I had a credit card bill, about $200. Usually my bills are for 50 or 100. Like, I use it once in a while if I don't have money. And I know I have the money to pay it. Right? It's not a problem for me. And the person's like, yeah, do you want to make the minimum payment? I said, no, I want to pay all of it, right? And he goes, you want to pay all of it? And they were surprised. And right then and there, I realized that, the people that go in there probably do make the minimum payment because of the reaction of the teller, that was an unusual reaction, that I wanted to actually pay this whole bill off. Based on that reaction, I could tell that most people that go in there would actually choose the latter, right? To pay the minimum, which is just stupid.
I've had that same reaction.
So I was really surprised. I guess I was raised very gullible, like in a sheltered environment, and as I grew up different from most people. Like my passion is reading. I love reading. I've got books about political science, the history of big corporations, the history of the banks, the credit cards, the mutual fund industry, all over the place. I've read all of them. So I've developed a very specific knowledge of how these systems operate, and I'm smart enough to avoid it. But I know a lot of people aren't, and I guess I just thought that, since these books are available for next to nothing, you can buy these books for $5 to $7 on abebooks.com. That website that hooks all the...
Abebooks, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good site. You can get good quality books for next to nothing. And, it's not Harry Potter, but these books are fantastic. Walter Stewart wrote 3 books, Bank Heist, How Our Canadian Financial Giants Are Costing You Money. He wrote Towers of Gold, Feed the Clay, the Canadian Banks, and he wrote The Golden Fleece, How the Stock Market Cost You Money. These are 3 fantastic books about the Canadian banking industry, and he sold 70 to 110,000 copies of each book. Guess who bought them?
The bankers.
People in the banking industry.
That's
and guess
right.
who they were written for?
Were they for everyone else?
Yeah, they're written for you and me, man, for the public, so that we wouldn't step in these traps or whatever. Unfortunately, most people who bought them were like who works for insurance business or the investment industry or the bankers. And when they read them, they're like, oh, this is awesome. Hoping, and they thought, oh, it's the end or something. But as the years went by, they realized the end will never come or whatever, actually, because very few people have an interest in this kind of thing. But this is the part of life that affects people the most, and this is the part of life that people understand the least. And that's why they can continue to do what they do, because they have all the information. So they leveraged it for profit, and people are a victim of it because they don't take a personal interest in it.
So from what you found about the banks, how do they do what they do, say?
Well, our banks are very innovative. Like in the 50s and 60s, they used to give toasters away if you opened an account. And the Americans would look at them and they're like, oh, well, why are they? That's pretty interesting or whatever. They were always like, the Canadian bankers have always been innovative. They've always been the first to do different things, like especially technological-wise. I mean, more Canadians do online banking and telebanking, per capita than people anywhere in the world. We're a very technologically advanced country. Canadians love the internet. They love technology. And this saves the banks a lot of money, and the banks know this, so they make it easy as possible, and that removes administration costs.
Yeah, I read something about that where because our banks are national, they put machines all over the country and you can get your money anywhere.
Yep.
In the States, it's very hard to do because banks are regional, local.
You're right.
And so if you bank at Wells Fargo and you're in Seattle and you try to go to Pittsburgh and find Wells Fargo, I think now you can find it, but there was a time when you couldn't. But our banks have always been everywhere.
Yeah.
So it was easy to set up that network, and they still have it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very efficient network. It's province-wide. It's countrywide. Our banks are in an oligopolistic situation. There's only 6 big banks: TD, Bank of Montreal, Scotia, Royal, National, and Canadian Western Bank, I guess. BMO, I guess, the other one.
Yeah, BMO, yeah.
So, did I miss anyone? TD, CIBC, sorry.
Yeah.
The ones that keep making the bad loans. So, well, remember when they sent people's records to a dumpster?
I remember that in the news, yeah.
Yeah, like CIBC has done some things that most businesses just wouldn't do, right? That's how relaxed they are. When they make big mistakes, they don't realize how big the mistake is or how much it'll hurt them. But getting back to the power that these 6 or 7 banks actually have, they control something like 91% of all the deposits in the country, 85% of all the loans, 85% of all the credits. That's more than 50%. In the States, there's 8,000 banks all competing for business. So in the States, you can get a better deal on a mortgage or a loan because you got people competing. Here you have no choice. You got 6 big banks. They bought up all the competition, and our government set it up purposely this way so that we'd have an efficient banking system. However, some could argue it became too efficient. It's healthy to have a degree of competition. It's always healthy that someone else is selling their product or service for less in order to give someone a better deal. Like when Walmart came to Canada, we might now get cheese cheaper from the grocery store. Instead of paying $7 or $8 for a bar, maybe we'll pay 3 or 4, because Walmart will force Loblaws to sell it for cheaper, because people will just go to Walmart, and maybe they'll be out of business if they don't do that kind of thing, because they're putting more pressure on them. You know, Loblaws introduces Joe Fresh brand, you know, to compete. You know, they're changing their store and everything. You know, like, competition is healthy in a free-based economy. So in the banking industry, there's no evidence whatsoever of competition. Other banks have tried to come here and compete, and it's too expensive to compete, because they'd have to invest so much money to set up their own networks, and it's too expensive to do that. And plus, the banks have also charged them exorbitant fees to use their networks, because they know they don't want them to compete with them. So a lot of them just pack up, sell their businesses. Of course, the banks are there to buy it. You know, another part of the oligopoly.
So you're talking about a physical network, like ABMs and...
Yeah. But not only that, it's an emotional connection too, right? The branches provide the emotional connection that the shoppers of financial products need to make a connection with, say, the managers when they go in there. You know, banking's it's a people business. You know, bankers know more about a man than his wife does, about his habits. That's what they said that as a joke in one of the books I read, and I thought that was pretty damn funny. You know,
yeah.
How could this be possible? You know, the guy doesn't even live in the same house with him that his wife lives. You know, how could he know more? But he knows about what he does with his money. Sometimes men will do things with their money that their wives won't know about. They'll spend things. The banker will know. He or she will have the records.
Spending records.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. You know, that you can learn a lot about someone from where they spend their money. You know, so.
Yeah, that was in the paper today. I read that 31% of divorces come from people not knowing what the spouse does with the money.
Wow.
So that's very timely that you say that.
That's pretty shocking. That's a pretty high percentage.
And I'm sure that's not new. I just happened to read it. This is just an update.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so the banks do I assume this is going on with mortgages. It's going on with all the services they do. It's the same strategy for all of them.
Yep.
Is that what you found? Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. When they get you for a 30-year mortgage, you will spend the next 30 years of your life paying it off. That's 30 years of predictable revenue and profit for the banks, and their shareholders demand it. Their shareholders have become institutionalized. When I say that, I mean between 1970 and 1990, the pension money that was swelling out of the private pension plans started pouring into the coffers of the money managers. There's about 2,000 to 3,000 of them. In Canada, there's about 1,500. There's more money managers in the States. You know, they've got bigger pension funds in the States. CalPERS. Here we've got OMERS, you know, the teacher's pension plan. They own trillions in assets, you know, like, or billions anyway. Like, it's a massive amount of money. Companies aren't worth that much, you know, but they own massive stakes. Sometimes they make companies do things they would never even consider doing. Like when Maple Leaf Foods, remember when they downsized their workforce and they hired temp workers in the 90s? When you used to work for if you worked for Maple Leaf Foods in the 80s or late 80s, you could make $16.50 an hour. By the 90s, it went to $8 an hour. Well, why was that? Well, there was pressure to boost profits. Well, what was the consequence of that? Listeria. It killed people. You know, Maple Leaf had to settle those lawsuits. That was a very expensive thing for Maple Leaf to do, to risk its entire company just to save a little bit of money. You know, and they scringed on safety, on the health. You know, like the machines became infected with that bacteria, and it got into the food and it killed Canadians. You know, it cost Canadians their lives because of the pursuit of profit came first before the welfare of the consumers. You know, Maple Leaf violated its own ethical guidelines. You know. One of the things that makes food companies successful is having, you know, a guideline for food safety, you know, that the public can trust. You know, the brand name's important, but if you sell, you know, food that kills you, you're not going to be in business for long, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So, have you found anything else about the banks that perhaps is not as mainstream as what you've said so far?
Well, they're very good at boosting profits. So if you're a shareholder of these companies, you'd be doing very well. They always increase the dividends. They use their massive cash flows to buy the shares back, which reduces the float, which, you know, boosts the share price. You know, they buy competitors. They buy U.S. banks. I think TD, they just bought. Well, they just made $6 billion investment in the States. They bought.
Yeah.
Did you read that or?
I did. I forget who it was.
Yeah, it was like
they bought Chrysler, but that was a
different
deal.
Yeah, sorry, Chrysler's financing unit, right? Yeah, and they're cherry picking U.S. assets because the U.S. is in big trouble. These companies, like Chrysler, is in big trouble. They got a bailout loan from the government, so they have to pay those loans back. So now they have to sell off divisions that aren't part of their core business lines. So Canadian banks, as usual, sat back and knew this was going to happen. And when it happened, boom, they're cherry picking all the assets. They're just picking it off, you know. I mean, $6.3 billion is a massive investment. You know, America's the largest economy, you know. It's the largest economy in the world, you know, and it's where everyone wants to sell their stuff, you know. So now the Canadian banks are taking advantage of this this opportunity, you know, in U.S. Financial weakness. You know, we're right there to, you know, take advantage of it. The shareholders for the TD Bank will be rewarded in 10 years. When the economy turns around, that Chrysler, that division's going to pump out hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. TD's profits will skyrocket. You know, and they'll look like geniuses, but they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything complicated. They just waited. They just took advantage of a professional opportunity that came their way through patience. You know, because they're not as gung ho as the American banks are. They don't make crazy loans to third world countries, and you know, we're better regulated. Our banks anyway.
Yeah.
You know?
From what I've seen, they are. Yeah.
So.
What I've found about. Well, our bank, when you mentioned efficiency earlier on, like to clear a check in Canada is much quicker than in the U.S.
Oh yeah.
In general, and I was inquiring as to why, and somebody said, well, it's because there's 6 clearing banks. The Federal Reserve banks do the clearing, and so when you write a check, it has to go from one to the other to get to the area that it has to go in. And in Canada, there's just one clearinghouse, which all the banks use. So instead of 2 days, it might take a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. I had no idea till I tried it.
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I didn't even know that. That's
you wouldn't even think, but so
it's pretty fast.
Saying our banks are efficient, that's pretty well known, I think, in the industry.
Yeah, but how well is it known into the public? Like how well does the public know this kind of stuff? How intimate are they with what is being done behind closed doors and the strategies that they use in order to get as much money out of the public as possible?
Yeah, I would guess not much.
Yeah, because if it was well known, maybe those profits wouldn't be so large. You know, I remember Royal Bank one year made $6 billion in profits a couple years ago. I'm like $1.5 billion every 3 months. I used to own shares. Well, I still do actually. I own shares in the Bank of Nova Scotia, and I remember when they cracked $1 billion every 3 months. I remember when they're making $607 million every 3 months. I thought, well, it is a global world, but how much money can you possibly make? And it just kept going up and up and up, and it still goes up, and it's still relatively high. It's extremely high. You know, the dividend at the time was like maybe $1.60. Now it's $2. You know, and in a couple years it'd be $3. You know, and I'm not, you know, making any bold predictions, or I'm not using any, you know, special calculations. I'm just telling you that they control the credit market, and they're going to make more profits in a couple of years because everyone uses credit, and they'll increase their dividend yields because their shareholders will demand it. Those institutions between 1970 and 1990 that bought stakes in all the big corporations are pressuring corporations to boost profits every 3 months at all costs. That's why they're getting rid of employees, because they want to boost profits. They can easily afford to have these employees on the payroll. The cash flow that the banks make are in the billions. The profits they make are in the billions. They can easily afford to pay somebody $30, $40, $50, $60, $70,000 a year if they want to. But they're under huge pressure to deliver to the shareholders. So that's the reason why they're getting rid of people, or they're moving jobs to India to make the software over there. You know what I mean? Like the outsourcing thing that's been going on. Yeah, because a programmer in India is $5,000. In China, it costs $5,000 to $7,000 American. In the States, you'll be paying a programmer $60,000 to $90,000, and in Canada, it's $40,000 to $60,000. So if you were a corporate manager, where would you want the software made? You know, if you had to be responsible for the budget of the bank.
So if you're talking to someone on the street and knowing this, well, what would you recommend them to do about it?
Just own the shares. It's a very simple, risk-free proposition. Like, you might as well buy a piece of the system. You're not going to beat it. I'm not going to beat it. Are you going to beat it?
Well, I guess not by yourself, I guess.
I don't think I want to beat it either. Like, I think I'm a fan of it. I like the banks. I like what they do. But then again, I do nonfiction research as a hobby. So when you do research on something, you develop a liking for it. You know, if I didn't like it, I wouldn't read about it. You know, so I have a very biased opinion. Some people hate the banks, you know. A lot of people don't like what they do, you know, but since I understand what they do and I can take advantage of what they do, I don't mind what they do. I know a lot of people end up, you know, destitutional in the process, and that might seem like a very harsh, you know, point of view for a person to have, right? But it's me or them. You know, we don't live in a charity, we live in a business economy, and it's kill or be killed or eat or be eaten, you know, like, and you've got to be, you know, either the fastest or the smartest or the most fleet-footed, and the only way you're going to do that is by knowledge acquisition, is by reading about it. That's simple, you know.
So when you say buy the shares, you mean directly buy the shares?
Yeah, buy it from their, they have dividend reinvestment plans that you can buy the shares right from their treasury. You could buy up to $20,000 a year worth of shares with no fees. They'll buy right on the open market, and the dividends go back into buying more shares, or you can ask for them to give you a cash check every 3 months. It's your choice. You know?
Yeah, so this is a drip plan you're describing here, right?
Yeah, it's a
dividend reinvestment.
Yeah, most of their employees have stock purchase plans that are similar to it, where the bank will chip in half of $1,500. Like the employee will put in $1,500, and the bank will put in maybe $750 every year. You know?
Yeah, I've experienced that before.
Yeah. Have you ever been a part of one, or
well, not for a bank, but for a fund company I was, yeah.
Yeah. Did you like it? I mean, what did you think about it? How did you feel about being an owner or a partial owner, even if it was a small amount?
It was actually pretty good.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, eh? Like owning a piece of the business you work for.
The company shares did go up.
Yeah, they usually do.
Well, all the time I've been working in the field, so yeah, there is something to it.
Yeah, and unlike the Industrial Revolution of 1902, where everyone was a slave for the factory, the information era is more of a level playing field. If you look at all the large corporations, Microsoft, Yahoo, Siebel Systems, Google, Dell Computers, they created a lot of tech millionaires. And that's because they gave shares of the company to the employees that helped them make the company into what it is today. And those people benefited from it. So that's the power of compound interest. When everyone shares in the wealth of a company, you're not just working for the company, you're a partial owner of it. Maybe not a huge owner, but if the company becomes globally large, you could benefit quite handsomely from it, especially if it's a Google or a Dell or a Microsoft, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's better that it's distributed that way, right? And I think that's one of the reasons the banks have to give their employees these kind of plans, because they can't justify making $6-7 billion a year and not giving it to their employees. Their employees are helping to make the money, you know? So that's just what I think anyway. I mean,
well, it's one way to look at it for sure. Yeah. We're going to take a break actually for a few minutes, and we'll be right back and talk with Shawn some more.
I can't remember last time the drapes were pulled open to reveal the outside world and let the sun warm the shattered nerves. No, I can't remember last time the sheets were washed, and I can't remember last time the teeth were flossed. I can't forget when and what I lost. Now I'm sleeping in my favorite shirt. I keep having dreams where I don't hurt. Sleeping in a bed I made, and I'm sleeping for 1,000 days. Sleeping for 1,000 days in my favorite shirts. It's been a long time since my face last showed up, reflected your best plates and cups. These days they're down in the sink with my luck, because I'm sleeping and nothing is bitter. When I'm sleeping, there's no better place. If I'm slumbering, the reasons are outnumbering the creases on my face. La 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la, la 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 la. Lullabies and good riddance, 'cause I'm sleeping in my favorite shirt. I keep having dreams where I don't hurt. Sleeping in a bed I made, for 1,000 days, sleeping for 1,000 days in my favorite shirts. The neighbor's dog has outside my window, amongst the grass that remains unmowed, and I'm oblivious to the world I used to know. Now I'm sleeping in my favorite shirt. I keep having dreams that I don't hurt. Sleeping in a bed I made, and I've been sleeping for 1,000 days, sleeping for 1,000 days, sleeping for 1,000,000 days, sleeping for 1,000,000,000 days, sleeping for 1,000,000,000 days, sleeping in my favorite shirt. Are bad this year. They buzz around my beer, making it hard to appear sincere, but I am. The stewardess was there. She let down her hair. She was putting on airs, though she was firmly on land. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. This fairy tale's turning monstrous. In a cab on Williamson, it all came back with a grin, as I was reaching in for 1550. Neil Young's greatest hits and R.E.M. on cassette. The soundtrack I won't soon forget to our movie. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. This fairy tale's turning monstrous. You share the same qualities as a damsel in distress. Same monogrammed handkerchief as Jesus, yeah. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. This fairy tale's turning monstrous. Yesterday I sat in a Vaughan Road laundromat, accepting that that is that, and washing you away. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. This fairy tale's turning monstrous. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. Fairy tales turning monstrous, monstrous, monstrous. Cindy Sherman's ears must be burning. I understand this show, it can't go on. We've been pretending for 8 years on. Now I know you've gone, and this heart's taking the greatest blow on earth, and it's leaving you with big shoes to fill, big shoes to fill. I know you want to, so I know you will fill these big shoes. I'm not a strong man, but I'm very tall. But you can make me feel oh so very small. Just like the dwarf in the 2 o'clock show. I'm a wonder of the world, and I wonder where swallower and the acrobat. They both agree your words were sharp as tacks. Now there's no turn.
Hello and welcome back to the Cube Talk Show. And the music you just heard is from the James Clark Institute. And that's the music for all of tonight's show. And we're back with Shawn for part 2 of our discussion. So I'll lead this one off with the topic of pensions. Now, from what you've read, what you've researched, what's your general opinion on pensions in Canada? Well, just start with that.
I think the government employees have probably the best pension plan. They call it gold plate pension plans. Are you familiar with those?
I've heard that term before, yeah.
So what do you know about them?
I mean, like defined benefit plans that guarantee you a
Absolutely.
payment at
Government's
the end of...
probably got the best defined benefit plans in the country. Maybe executives have pretty good ones too, of golden parachutes, where they're guaranteed so much if they, slip up and make a big mistake and lose their job, they will get well compensated. They make sure it's part of the agreement when they get hired. It's just the cost of doing business. Employees on the lower end of the spectrum, however, almost have no access to a private plan whatsoever. And they're left out in the cold. They usually have to depend on the Canada Pension Plan. And that's our universal plan for the country.
So, what I've seen with that is if you're unionized, if you're a government employee, or if your company has a defined benefit plan, then you'll have one. And if they don't have one, then you don't have one. They'll have one where you put your own money in and you invest it. Defined contribution plan, and you have to build your own retirement basically.
I think the best ones for companies, if you work for a corporation that has a stock purchase plan, the company's been around, like say one of the big 6 banks or a big oil company that's been around for a while, and they've got a record of success in a financial achievement, you could do pretty well doing that. Or if you work, say, for the teachers, or you're right, for the government sector, you can get a pretty good plan because they have them available. But if you worked for Inco, the mining giants in the 80s, they had a surplus of $105 million. And an employee of 30 years would get $1,000 a week for the rest of their lives. That $104 or $5 million would have made retirement a lot better, especially since it came from employee contribution. But the way the law is structured, if there's enough benefits in there to meet the demand, then anything left over is... all the company had to do was apply to the Pension Commission of Ontario and say, yeah, we have enough money to meet our obligations. There's this extra $104 million or $5 million stuck in this plan. We want it. They can just take it, right? And do you remember the Dominion fiasco with Conrad Black?
I've heard about that.
Yeah, it's like $37 million of surplus assets, or if, and it was discovered by an employee who just had a question. His store was being winded up, and he got transferred to other stores. And he found out the money was being used to wind up the stores.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was pretty shocking.
These were in the news, these stories.
Yeah, and
from a while back, yeah.
And they also faded from the headlines just as they appeared, and a lot of people didn't understand what had happened. But people really got taken advantage of in those situations, especially since the money came from their own contributions. Anne Finlayson wrote a book called, I think it was 1984, it was called Whose Money Is It Anyway? The Showdown on Pensions. And it was about those kinds of plans, the private plans. And there was scandal after scandal. You can get the book on abooks.com for a couple bucks, $5 to $7. It's an old book, but it's very well written and it's very well researched. It's one of the books that I have in my own pension library, and I thought it was very fascinating when I read it. I was very surprised to learn that this is the kind of things that go on in the pension world.
So what other books do you have in your library about pensions? Do you have any offhand that any titles?
Peter Drucker wrote a book in 1976 called Unseen Revolution, How Pension Fund Socialism Came to America. Have you ever heard of that book or read it?
Not till now, no.
No, eh? Okay. Well, in it, he said the American worker owns the corporations through their pension plan, and they don't even know it. Through the accumulation over time, So the knowledge workers will own the pension plan, will own the company through the shares, through the acquisition of shares indirectly. So he said that our economy has moved from a free base economy into something called pension fund socialism, where the ownership of the shares of the largest corporations in the world, GM, Ford, the big 6 banks in Canada, the 8,000 banks in the States, foreign corporations in European countries, are all owned by the pension managers, because they're given money and they have to risk it. They have to take risks with the money in order to get returns, or else there's no point doing it, right? So in a 20-year period, they literally acquired, even though the book was written in 1976, it was a very good barometer for what happened 24 years later in the 90s, from the accumulation that started as a trickle in the 70s and became a massive flood in the 80s as more people became, closer to retirement. More money just poured into the hands of managers. So that's one book in specific about pensions that was written early that pretty much predicted what was going to happen a couple decades later. And I think they call him the father of modern management, Peter Drucker. He wrote lots of other books as well on management. He was a very successful writer. All his books are studied by all the major universities in Canada and the States and in Europe. All the developed nations study his material because he's such a astute researcher of business. He's such a visionary. He was right about so many things. They have no choice but to study his material. Because he's one of those people who paved the way. In a dark and murky world, he shone the light on areas that were unknown to people. He showed through common sense and through a little bit of a little bit of research that you can make these predictions. You just have to look at trends, And he didn't have all these sophisticated computer models like they have today, and he used basic information to make them. He was very accurate. He's one of the best writers in the world, I think, anyway. At least one of the best writers I've ever written. So, and I read a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So any other names you can pass out in terms of book titles?
There was one book called Pensions versus Stock Markets, and that book talked about how stock markets are being used to basically generate trading revenue or profits. Like they're making more of their money through trading. A long time ago, being a money manager was a boring job. You bought a couple bonds, you bought a couple stocks, and you went on vacation for a couple months and forget about it, because inflation didn't exist until the 70s, the first the Arab oil embargo, which has made energy prices rise from $1.70 to $3, then $6 to $12, and that's when the U.S. fell into recession because they were dependent on cheap oil, right? So yeah, not until the 70s did inflation become a factor. That's when money managers had to start worrying about things like inflation. And it wasn't until the 90s when they started having to worry about things about returns. Like as soon as computers became a reality, they could measure the performance of certain, business aspects. So the natural thing to do was to measure the results of the money managers, and it changed the money management game completely. It made it into a very short-term oriented, business. You worked in the business. Do you want to comment on that, or do you agree with it, or is it short-term oriented?
I would say that. Yeah. I mean, the news kind of tells you that.
But aren't the assets in the fund by nature long-term?
Oh, they are. That's the intention. But the news will tell you everything, because every quarter they announce things, and there's such a reaction. If it was long-term, who would care about 3 months, 1 month, 12 months? It's a 30-year stock. But people react, and the prices are much more volatile. That's another indicator that people are looking at the short term. So, it is short term. And in the past, I followed the markets since the 80s, and there was volatility then, but now there's a lot more of it, and it's more often, and it's over the smallest things. In the past, if something happened that was major, like the 87 crash, you would see it because it's a crash. Now every year there's some panic of some sort, and you'll see, and then now we have the VIX indicators that tell you how volatile it is. So this is kind of extending what you're saying about the models. Now we have models derived on other models that measure volatility, so now it's getting even more. There's a second layer, third layer of this.
That sounds totally insane.
Well, you could look at it that way, but that's what you see now. The VIX, if you've ever seen the VIX, that's what that is, volatility index.
I know that Warren Buffett took advantage of the psychological fear in 1988 when he bought Coca-Cola shares for $5. he invested $500 million of cash, of Berkshire Hathaway stock, of cash into Coca-Cola shares. 10 years later, the stock was $60. Those are the things legends are made of. He looked at common sense reality. He looked at Coca-Cola as a great long-term business that's not only been around a long time, it'll be around a lot longer, and it'll be successful a lot more often than it'll be unsuccessful. So without all these like fancy indicators that you mentioned that they're now using to try to, squeeze, water out of rocks, I guess. Sometimes there's no water in the rocks, usually there's just dust. But he makes short-term thinking look kind of foolish. Like he's a very long-term, he's a very patient guy. Him and his team of managers at Berkshire Hathaway, they're very down-to-earth, sincere people, but they're also business people. They look at things in 20, 30-year increments, and that's why they can be so patient, because they've been successful in the past using this mentality. I don't think anything's ever happened overnight. Most of the big companies that have started up have taken years to become successful from whatever strategies they've used. I've never known a professional manager to think in 1 week or 3 month increments. Usually they have a 3, 5 year. In Japan, they have 20, 30-year plans or 50-year plans. That's why the Japanese are so efficient at their at competing with the other businesses. They got Honda and they've got Hyundai. They've got a variety of multi-billion-dollar corporations that are successful because they thought long-term and not short-term. This short-term thinking is spilling over into our lives. We're becoming so short-term oriented that as employers, for employees, we don't want to keep people as long as we kept them. They want to hire just students because they're cheap. They can be hired again for cheap because there's so many are coming out. There's the relationship area of people's lives. No one's staying with their significant other anymore. Just trade them in for someone better looking or younger. Or, this mentality is becoming like mainstream. Yeah, it's becoming a lifestyle. I think it's pretty toxic. I think things are long-term for a reason, and they're healthier when they're long-term. I plan to have the friends I have for a long period of time. I'm not going to throw them in the gutter for new friends. That's ridiculous. I invest a lot of time and energy in the people in my life, and I expect quality because I invest the time and energy in this kind of thing. If I own shares of a company, I'm not going to just sell it for a couple bucks. I'm going to hold on to it for a long time. I'm going to hold on to I'm never selling my Scotia shares, ever. It's a very long-term thing. Maybe one day it'll be worth more, and I think it will be, actually. They're very successful at running that business. It's in 66 countries. They just don't operate. They're Canada's most international bank. And we live in an international economy. It's a global world. So they can take advantage of it. Their management are smart enough to do business in other countries. They're doing business in South America. Royal's doing business in the States. They're making, TD made some acquisitions, the Chrysler acquisition we talked about earlier. They make those acquisitions not on a 3-month basis because their stock might go up a buck. They make them looking in the next 20 years saying, we're going to be making $30 billion in profits over the next 30 years, maybe $1 or $2 billion a year, something like that, right? They have to think that way. They can't just buy something for $6 billion. They have to justify that kind of purchase. That is a massive amount of money, I doubt short-term thinking came in anywhere, even grazed their mind when they considered making that kind of investment on behalf of shareholders. This was something that was planned for a long time. They looked at it, they sent in teams of people to assess it, teams of professionals from their auto analyst division. The banks have got armies of people with knowledge that is extremely reliable. And these people can deliver reports that are crisp, accurate, and predictable, and that's why they're hired. And they tell the management if it's good or not, and if it's not good, they won't buy it. But they don't buy it on short-term, beliefs or whatever. They buy it because in the long term, it's going to boost shareholder value, and that's their job. They'll be fired if they don't boost shareholder value, but they have to do it in the long term because these things take time. Anything good in your life will take time. It's something you have to work at. What do you think about the long-term versus short-term mentality?
Yeah, well, that's what I do as well. Like I use the entrepreneur as an example. When you build the company, it'll take 3 years minimum just to build it. It'll take 5 to 10 just to make it profitable, and then it'll take 20 before you enjoy it, and then you'll cruise on for decades later and then pass it off. And even when you pass it off, it takes years to pass it off because you're going to get somebody who's fitted for the job. Either it's a family member, either it's a partner, either it's another shareholder.
Yeah, you want someone who cares because you've invested your blood, sweat, and tears in this, and it's a long-term thing and it's important. So investments should be looked at in the same way,
And By and large, yeah, that's the way that works.
Yeah, I think investments have been sold under the guise of products, and I want to talk about mutual funds.
The products, okay.
Yeah. What do you think about mutual funds? What's your opinion on them? Would you own them?
Do I buy them?
Yeah.
No, I don't have them.
I used to own them a couple of years ago.
The way I look at them now is, if they do something that you can't find somewhere else, like a very specific area, I buy them for that. If it's something general like buying bonds, I generally don't. I'll buy the bonds themselves. And the argument for that is just the fees, and also because, well, partly it's because I've been in the industry, so I know what to look for. If someone doesn't know, it's a different story. They might say, well, I don't know, I'll just buy the generic thing because, you know, I don't have time to research, I don't know what to ask, and etc. But for me, if it's something I cannot do myself, I'll buy that. And, you know, like the Chinese fund, I can't buy Chinese shares, period. Even if I know what to buy, I just can't buy them. One day you will. One day they'll be traded worldwide, just like the US and just like Europe, but that's still coming up. Same with even Japanese shares. You can buy them, but it's very difficult and expensive. So if you believe in those things, those areas, you can't buy them, so you have to buy a mutual fund, and whatever the fees are, you pay it because that's what you have. And so that's how I use them. And if it's you know, Canadian stock, then I'll just say, okay, well, I know I'm here, I can buy Canadian stock.
Yeah,
so
you buy what's local, right? Like in your grocery store, you buy what the farmer made. So if you buy shares of a bank because you've been in it, or you've been in the grocery store, Loblaws publicly traded, you can see, or your Bell, you can see all the Bell stores around. You know they're making money. Or Canadian Tire, you can see their big stores on the corner. You see lots of people going in and out. You have an idea that they're making some kind of money and they're doing pretty well. They've been around for a long time, you know. If I had the choice between Japanese and Chinese, I would definitely veer more towards Japanese, because the Japanese economy was rebuilt by the Americans after the Second World War, and it was rebuilt in the model of the American-style business economy. They've got a very competitive. A lot of people say the Japanese take crap and turn it into gold. And they're very good. They don't have a lot of resources. They're an island that has to import a lot of their, you know, raw materials like oil and everything. They're very, very efficient at using every little piece of everything into making something tangible that someone would want to pay money for, you know. And their name, even their name brand, has recently taken a hit because of the poor quality autos, you know, the Honda or whatever. But for years, when they were on top of the quality, they were on top of the world. You know, they were giving the American companies, they're keeping them up at night, you know.
They were,
and their
yeah.
They were, and their mentality is very long term. They have 50, 100-year business plans. I don't think the American executives have these kind of long-term plans. Look at all the problems they're having. You know, bailouts by the government, major plant closures all over the place, Canada and the States. But, you know, keeping things in perspective, when you talk about the mutual fund fees, there's a book, I've read 7 books on the mutual fund industry, and one of the very first book I read, I got it for my birthday, and this is when I owned mutual funds. I wanted to be a money manager, and I was curious, and the money managers will, yeah, if you want to be a money manager, just take the securities course and, you know, get some books on the banking industry or something. So I took his advice, and I found out a book called The Money Machine, so I asked for my birthday. And halfway through, I had a breakdown. I was really upset what I was reading. Apparently, it's just a business, and all they want to do is make money off you, or off me, or off anyone else. Because my mutual fund that I owned 2 of them, by the way, back in the 90s. I owned an Asia Pacific fund, and I owned a North American fund. And do you remember when the Asia Pacific market collapsed? Remember the? Yeah, well, I owned. Yeah, that was 2,500 to 1,400 in my for my fund, but the North American market did well. It went up by a couple hundred, so I broke even, and I was confused. I'm like, how does a money manager lose money? That's his job, you know. So halfway through the money machine, I got really upset or whatever, and I called the money manager at the time. He worked for a pretty big firm. His name was even advertised on the radio, so apparently he had good returns. I said, yeah, I just read the money machine. You could hear a pin drop. He was so silent, and he finally goes, don't believe everything you read. And I said, yeah, well, don't believe everything anyone tells you either. And I slammed the phone down, and I told my mom, I'm like, I want these funds sold right away. I don't want nothing to do with these mutual funds. Because when I finished reading The Money Machine, I found out that if you own one, you have to pay you have to pay commission when you buy it, There's a deferred sales charge between 1% and 5%. There's a front-end load fee, a rear-end load fee, a redemption fee. Redemption means if you sell for any reason within a certain period of time, they hit you with that. It's between 0.5 and 2.5%. You know, they're robbing you, man. Every 10 years, you're paying a quarter of every dollar you give them. Every $100 is $25 minimum into their pocket, and they don't guarantee anything. They're just gambling with your money. So after I learned that, I started looking into other ideas that would basically benefit myself instead of someone with a suit and tie sitting behind a computer who didn't really care about me, because that's the image I now had in my mind of these people. You know, and they're all the same. They all do the same thing. They all go through the same. They'll get their, you know, security license. They might work for different companies. You might get a cheaper fee than somebody else, but their goal is to make money for themselves. I mean, it's a business. It's not a charity. They want to maximize the amount they make for themselves. That's just human nature. You go, you know, you study something. You want to get the most for your education, you know. The problem with the commission system is it conflicts with the consumer system of trying to save a buck on stuff. When you go to the grocery store, you don't want to pay $10 for cheese. You want to buy it for $3 or $4. So there's a conflict of interest in the commission-based industry for selling of financial products, because if you want the best life possible as a money manager, you have to sell the most expensive product, whether or not it's suited for that particular client or not. It's just common sense for them anyway. And for you, trying to get a product, you want to pay the lowest fee possible, and you want to make the most profit or the most return. You know, so my advice is buy the shares directly. Cut the middleman out completely, or woman, you know, because these days men and women are money managers, and they're both very well. They both do well at managing the people's money, but they charge you a fortune for it. It's not worth it, you know, and they don't guarantee you anything. If they lose all your money, or do you remember the internet tech fund in the '90s? It had over $2 billion in assets. It went down 90%. Can you imagine being in that thing? The anxiety.
Yeah, I was following that.
You know, it's shocking.
So we have a few minutes left.
Okay.
If you'd like to give a contact name, website, where people can contact you
for
more information.
The website is www.endoffees.ca, ENDOFFEES. It's 3 words in one, no spaces. And my name is Shawn Dalton, and my phone number is 416-557-5666. I'm available after Friday and on the weekend, because those are my days off. So I'd be available on those days. And yeah, that's where I upload my book reviews. I review books and just write reviews on them, and you and I are writing a book, so hopefully someone will buy that, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
If we're lucky.
Okay, well, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And so, so the show, the Cube Talk show, is airs every third Tuesday at 6 p.m. You can watch it on thatchannel.com in the archives, or you can watch it on my website, www.joetheinvestor.ca. It is now live, so you can do it any time. And I'm also on Twitter at @JoeTheInvestor. And thanks for watching, and have a good evening.
Craft in Lake Monona last night. December waters are cold. Lord have mercy on the king of soul. Something crashed in Lake Monona last night. Well, my heart sank in Lake Monona last night. She made me walk the plank on Lake Monona last night. She said to quote the song, she'd been loving me too long. Something crashed in Lake Monona last night. Down, down, down like a song in the charts. You know his crown was found by some some record shop.